Welcome to the Modern Homesteading Podcast.
We have allowed ourselves to become so disconnected and ignorant about something that is as intimate as the food that we eat.
Be prepared to grow your own for victory.
God said, I need somebody strong enough to clear trees and heave bales, yet gentle enough to yean lambs and wean pigs and tend the pink-combed pullets who will stop his mower for an hour to splint the broken leg of a meadowlark. So God made a farmer.
Today I want to talk about something that I kind of had to learn a little bit about a couple years ago when I was looking for something to integrate into my food forest. And I was looking for a good understory tree or something in the bush layer that I could plant under my taller tree, something that would do well, something that would be useful, and something that would just be a really great addition to a permaculture food forest. And I came across hazelnut kind of on accident. I was in the process of looking for something, and I happened to visit a local nursery. And at that nursery, he was selling small hazelnut bushes. And I thought, let me check into that a little bit. And I started doing a little bit of research. So I went ahead and picked up a couple plants. And then I started doing some research. And I found out it's just an excellent plant to add to the food forest. And I want to talk a little bit about growing it, why I think it's a great plant for the food forest, kind of how to integrate it into the food forest today. So I think it might be one you'll enjoy if you're looking to build a food forest, or you're just looking to add another plant to your homestead somewhere. It doesn't have to be into necessarily a food forest. You can plant it in a lot of different places and add it to your property. And I think it's just a great plant. Now, I'm only into a couple years of having mine on my property, so I'm not really into the production phase yet, but I'm really looking forward to the benefits of having this plant on the property other than just filling up a spot in my understory right now. So let's just jump right into it and talk a little bit about hazelnut. So what is hazelnut? Well, hazelnuts are bushes that can grow really tall. Hence, they have a shrub-like appearance, but they can also be used as an understory tree. I mean, a lot of people refer to them as a hazelnut tree or a hazelnut bush. They kind of can go either way, depending on how you prune them, where you grow them. But the plant can actually get a height and width of about 16 feet, so it can get very large. Now, you can, that's kind of optimal conditions, perfect sunlight conditions, perfect ground moisture, things like that. But you can prune it any way you want it. You can prune it into more like a tree or more into shrub like a plant. So it can kind of fill that void whichever way you want it to go. If you want it into a tree, you just kind of cut the lower branches and leave a few stems at the center, and it'll kind of grow more into a tree-like design, or you can just, like I said, let it spread out and become a bush. Now, they can grow up to, they grow normally around 40 years, but they can go as long as 100 years. I mean, it's a really long growing and producing plant. Most of that life, it's going to be producing nuts for you. So it's a plant that's going to be in your food forest for a very long time, just like a larger tree in some situations. Initially, they're native to eastern and southern parts of Europe, and over time they spread into the north and east parts of the world. And evidence of hazelnut remains are found in parts of China as well. It's not something that grows there today normally, unless you plant it there. But there's remnants that it's been brought there at one point and was grown there. Throughout times in history, hazelnut was considered a staple food for humans. It was kind of spread worldwide. At one point, Turkey was its dominant supply, accounting for about 80% of the world's supply, and the rest of the 20% being produced from countries like the United States and parts of Europe. It's really been used worldwide in a lot of ways as food production. It has a lot of varieties. Some are the results of genetic breeds that are crossed together, and others just adaptation from the traditional species. There's two real significant breeds that are most commonly used, but the real difference would be the size of the nuts and the growth rate of the plant. And I'm going to talk about hazelnut through the eyes of looking at the common species. I mean, there's other varieties, but there's these common varieties that end up in most places. That's what I'll be referring to mostly in this podcast episode. Hazelnut flowers are actually wind pollinated. So these plants actually don't even need pollinators like bees or butterflies for pollination. The plants have separate male flowers called catkins, and at the end of summer and the beginning of spring, the catkins shed pollen early before leaves emerge, and then the female flowers emerge from a bud and require pollen from a second tree because they're self-incompatible, so you have to have more than one. For that reason, the two pollen-compatible strains of hybrid trees are planted in an orchard. So you'll want to have a couple different trees or bushes of hazelnut around to pollinate, but they are wind pollinated, which is kind of fascinating. Hazelnuts prefer moist lowland soils. Now, I'm going to verify this because I've planted in a couple different places, and I have one that's kind of right out in the front of my property, direct sunlight all day long. It gets full sun all day long. It's kind of a drier area because it's out in the sun, and I'm actually going to have to plant an overstory tree next to that. I've got it kind of by itself, kind of out there in the sun, and I need to get some shade on it and cool it down and get some plants around that one, like some comfrey or something, to kind of shade the ground, hold a little bit more moisture in the ground. Make sure you get more wood chips around it. Make sure I get more wood chips around it to kind of moisten that soil up, because it doesn't do very well. It's like it's alive and it's growing very, very slowly, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of progress. And the complete opposite of that, I got one that's got about half day sun in a more moist area with a little bit of shade and just a little bit of stuff around it, and it's doing great. It's 3 times the size of the other one, and so it just kind of verifies they like that. They like that moist, kind of gentle growing area. They like to grow in hedgerows, along meadows, on the edges of pastures, things like that, banks of streams or rivers, edges of woods, places where they get, I would say, an adequate amount of sun, but I think they don't do as well in full sun, which I think makes them a great understory or bush layer tree in a food forest. They do like steep slopes. They like to be along paths and roadsides. So they're kind of easy to find in the wild in certain areas because they're kind of like, I kind of think of them like, generally if you're going to find like blackberries and raspberries growing in the wild, they're kind of in those type of areas, that half day sun, kind of thickets and things. They're kind of in those kind of areas where you'll find things like that. So hard to get to sometimes in those areas, but also along the edges a lot of times in forests and things because of the break in the shade and the sun. They do like some sun. They need at least 4 hours. I would say 6 hours is probably ideal for them if I had to take a guess. If you're going to plant some hazelnut bushes, springtime is really the best time to plant, right after the first frost. When the plants are dormant, and that way they don't get shocked. It's just like most trees or bushes. They do best when you plant them in that situation. If you're going to plant them from seed, it's kind of a process, though. I've not tried it. I've watched some videos on it. I'd like to expand mine one day when mine start producing nuts, and actually grow them from the nuts. But you can. There's a whole process involved in the pre-treatment and preparation of the seeds. I guess I could talk a little bit about that from what I've learned. You can take a bucket of water, you can drop the seeds in them or the nuts in them and allow them to settle. And then some will float and others will sink. The ones that sink are the ones that are ones you want to plant. They're more likely to germinate. Those ones that float can germinate, but they're less likely, and it's probably going to be a less healthy seedling from what I understand. You do want to put them, lay them out in pots or like a grow bed or something and cover them with sand, and then top it off with something to keep the squirrels or the chipmunks or the mice from digging them up, because they enjoy them. They'll dig them up and they'll take them. Now, once the seeds start germinating, you want to get them in some pots, and you'll want to put them an inch or so deep, inch to 2 inches deep. Make sure they're firm and water them in really well, and keep them moist. They like I said, some moist soil. You don't want it standing in water, but they do like to be kept moist. You don't want to let that soil dry out. And then you'll just kind of wait. You'll need to keep the weeds and the grass off of them. Don't let them compete, because they're going to need that time to grow and get the nutrients. So, you'll want to keep the grass and weeds around them. And you want to let them grow in a pot or in an area where they're going to kind of mature as seedlings for a couple years. And then you're going to want to transplant them. And you'll want to wet the hole really good, get their feet good and wet, transplant them. And you'll want to dig a hole big enough to to take in their whole root structure. Don't try not to damage them, and then just kind of tamp it in, just like you would a tree, any tree, and add lots of water. They're going to need some water. They just like wet feet. They really do. I've just kind of learned that the hard way. It was something in my early studies that I didn't come across, but I'm actually at the point, like I said, I'm either going to have to do some real additions to that area where I have the one, which I could do, and I probably will do, honestly, or I'm going to have to move it, because if I just leave it to its own self there, it's probably never going to get healthy. It's not. So I'm going to have to work on that a little bit, or move the plant. But they do like to be moist. Like I said, not standing in water, not swamp like, but they definitely like the ground to be a little bit moist. And you'll want to let them grow, 3 or 4 years before you cut them back. Coppice them or start pruning them, because they're kind of slow growing. Even the one that I've got that's doing well, it's still not producing, of course, a couple years later. It's still, it's 3 times bigger than the other one, which still isn't huge. We're talking, 4 feet by maybe 3 feet wide. The other one is like, 16 inches. It's a lot smaller. So it does take them a while. They're kind of slow getting started, but once they get there, you're gonna have a great plant. They're pretty resistant to pests and diseases, other than the nuts. The squirrels and chipmunks and rodents really like the nuts, so they're going to attack the nuts once you get them mature. But if you have a lot of them, and you can somehow control them, or even with some netting or whatnot, you can get a lot of production from them, even with the hazelnut predators, I'll call them. Now, because of the situation with my one plant, I have done a little bit of homework on best companions for hazelnuts, and they really like nitrogen fixing plants that improve the soil around them. So they like plants like comfrey, which, lucky for me, got a lot of that. Primrose, coriander. Believe it or not, they can kind of be intertwined with asparagus, garlic, currants, other kind of bulb plants they like. You want to avoid plants like fennel, leeks, and beets. What I came across in my research, these were plants that they don't do that well with. They're also one of the few plants, now this is interesting, they're one of the few plants that is pretty juggling resistant, meaning it can be planted as a barrier plant between walnut trees and other plants. That's a huge problem with a lot of permaculture food forests. A lot of people want walnut in their food forest, but because of the juglone that it produces, it's not an ideal tree for a food forest, because other plants have a hard time growing around it, but not hazelnut. Hazelnut actually does well with a walnut tree. So it can be kind of create this barrier. If you wanted to kind of surround a walnut tree with hazelnut bushes to kind of get this root barrier going, it'll actually tie up a lot of that. It'll keep it from spreading out further, and then you can move on to the next plantings of things beyond that. So that's interesting to find out about it, because walnut is an excellent thing to have in your food forest. If you could put it somewhere where where it ties in nicely, and then you can kind of bind up that juglone so it doesn't affect the other food forest plants, that's pretty awesome. And from what I've read and found out, that hazelnut is a plant that can do that. Okay, let's talk about a little bit about the growing conditions. I've obviously been mentioning some about that, but it grows in areas with cooler, moist summers really well. It'll grow, again, because in permaculture, we create microclimates. We can change the climate for a plant. And so when I talk about ideal growing conditions, we tend to think about a place or an area in the world that automatically meets these conditions. And obviously, the plant's going to do best more naturally in those places. But we can go several zones either way a lot of times, and we can create these microclimates that we can grow a lot of different plants. And hazelnuts like that. If you don't have a place that meets these climates, think about how you can adjust your climate, how you can create this microclimate that will offer ideal growing conditions for this plant. So yeah, it does really well in cool or moist summers. Well, that isn't a lot of places. Mild, cool winters or maritime climates does really well. Any tropical or subtropical climates are ideal for growth. And there's also different species that, of course, that grow differently, have a little bit different growing conditions ideally. So you have to do a little bit of homework there, and you have to create this climate. It's not ideal for everyone, but it can grow in a lot of places where maybe you wouldn't think it would grow. We find that with a lot of plants. Soil, it likes loamy soil. It doesn't have to be high in nutrients. Matter of fact, it kind of prefers it not be. It likes those kind of garbage areas like a lot of plants do, because it likes its soil neutral, primarily neutral. So obviously you don't want to put it next to blueberries and things like that. It's going to need a different type of soil. But again, it's not going to require a lot of soil. So you could plant it with things that are, that will pull all the nutrients away. But you don't want to plant it next to anything that you're going to have to feed heavily with nutrients, because it could overwhelm the hazelnut bush. So you want to keep things that are similar to it, that don't require a lot of nutrients, that will mine its own nutrients, that aren't going to you're not going to have to feed, because that feeding that plant could actually harm this plant if you're feeding it also. Moisture. Hazelnuts flourish in moderately well-drained soils that retain too much water or drain too much water, what I'm finding more as true, will not encourage healthy growth. So kind of in the middle there. You don't want it, like I said, swamp ground, but you don't want dry soil either. They don't do well in that. The reason you don't want a super rich soil for hazelnut, and the reason you don't want to have a soil that's heavy in fertilizer, is because it causes the plant to leaf at the expense of putting off nuts. So you don't need overly fertile ground. So again, but that's like that with most plants. You can actually fertilize tomatoes to the point where you hardly get any tomatoes, and you just get a lot of leaves. So again, it's the same way. You don't want. Obviously, we're not just growing a food forest for the leaves. We want the actual food from it. So you don't want too rich of a soil, because it will cause it to produce more leaves than nuts. Sunlight. Everything I read says more sunlight encourages more fruit yield. But I don't know. Maybe once it gets to a certain size, that's probably true. But in the early stages, I guess you can just keep that ground super moist, and you got just like some dappled shade throughout the day. I find it likes a little bit of shade. And it really can tolerate the shade more than it can tolerate the sun when it's really hot and dry. But it needs at least 4 hours, and I would say ideally probably 6, 7 of sunlight to do great. And the plant likes to be protected. It doesn't like extremely windy locations. It doesn't like frost pockets. It doesn't like extremely hot or extremely dry. It just, it's kind of, I'd say it's delicate. It's not really, because it will grow in some places where some things won't grow, but it does take a little bit of care. I mean, if it had to pick its place, it's not going to pick that place that it's kind of the extreme conditions. So you want to kind of accommodate that, because it does slow things down or makes it harder to grow for sure. And once it's, from everything I read, and what I'm experiencing, like with my better plant, is once it's growing well, you really don't have to do much to it. It doesn't require a lot. There are a few things you'll want to do to maintain a healthy plant, but mostly it does pretty well. Pruning is probably the thing that a lot of people want to focus on once a hazelnut tree / bush gets to a little bit more maturity. But those reasons, there are some health reasons in that, but mostly it's probably use and where you have it. So let's talk a little bit about pruning. It does encourage the tree to grow stronger and have trunks. If you want a tree, you can skip the pruning. If you have a potted nut tree, or you have it in an area where you're using it like a bush, it will get very, very large, though. Like I said, about 16 by 16, which is a big, big plant. But when you're pruning it tree-like, or you're trying to limit its growth area, you want to choose about 6 strong branches at the top and then cut everything below it. You should really clear any low-hanging branches. If you allow the plant to stay in its natural shrubby form, you don't need to shape the tree. You might want to snip any suckers that grow from the roots and thin the bush kind of evenly, just to kind of keep it from getting too big, taking over too much of your food forest. But you'll want to do this in the winter when the plant's dormant. And by pruning it back, it does keep the additional stems from congesting the plant, and it'll keep the plant a little more airy and light and easier to harvest from, and just generally looking better in your food forest probably. So, I mean, there's just some general maintenance to pruning, like most trees or shrubs. The trunks actually can scald from sun and injury from rodent. They can get injury from rodents also in the wintertime especially. So mulching around the tree once you've planted it, it will ensure that there's no weeds kind of growing up around it. It'll allow the plant to kind of grow and flourish. You just keep it mulched. It really likes that because it helps with the soil, helps keep that soil moist also. And water it if it's necessary. Hopefully you can get your soil conditions and your shade conditions and everything just right where you don't have to do that. But I would say in those first few years, you may have to water it if you're in a location that it isn't ideal on the moisture levels. Don't add fertilizer, as I mentioned earlier, unless your soil is just dead. I mean, and even then, wood chips, adding some like leaf mulch, doing chop and drop, things like that are plenty of fertilizer for this plant. Naturally, it does like a little nitrogen though. So if you could plant something like comfrey or do chop and drop comfrey leaves around it, or plant it next to some nitrogen fixing trees, things like that, it will do well because it does give it more resistance to pests and diseases, and naturally just makes it a little healthier. And it will encourage leaf growth. But in those first few years, that's really not a bad thing. And before it gets to its real serious nut production anyway, it's really a good thing. It really actually builds a healthy, strong plant. So that's really good for it. When it comes to actual pests and diseases, mostly it's the nuts they're looking for. They can decimate a crop from what I understand. A few chipmunks and squirrels can just completely clean off your plants. And there's a few things you can do. But there's also some insects that will attack as well, like nut weevils, and there's some worms, and they are prone to like some kinds of blight. It's not super common, I don't think, but it's a fungus that can affect them. Tent caterpillars, like hazelnut, surprisingly, I found out aphids can affect the plant, which that's a pretty easy thing to get rid of. And there's some other pests and diseases like powdery mildew and root rot and things like that can affect hazelnut. It's not huge problems with hazelnut, but there are things you do have to keep an eye out for and be prepared to treat if necessary. The things that will hinder its growth, what I found out: extreme heat, extreme cold, and extreme moisture or being dry. These things will affect the growth of your plant. I've seen it. I've read about it. It's true in my experience. Let's talk a little bit about harvesting. Now, here's why you plant things, right? Here's why you want this plant in your food forest, on your property, because you want the food. So when it comes to harvesting, you can just pick the nuts from the tree, or you can wait for them to fall from the tree. You can shake it and get the more ripe nuts to fall. And it's actually, I didn't know this, but I actually found out it's actually quite common to for the first few nuts that you harvest that fall are empty. I don't know why that is, but I read that it's common. Like you start grabbing the first ones that fall, and then you find out there's nothing inside of them. They're just like hollow nuts. That's actually common. And for whatever reason, I think a lot of people freak out about that. I think there's something seriously wrong with their hazelnut tree, but the fact is that's just common with them. The first few ones that drop are hollow nuts, and you'll want to spread them out to dry for the next 2 to 3 weeks. In a warm place. I actually ran across a video from Edible Acres on harvesting hazelnuts and how they spread them out in these trays and stack them and dry them and like these old crate boxes they've made. You could use cloth bags, nets, whatever. You could do a lot of different ways to kind of dry them out and then store them. But I thought their video was pretty good. Actually, the article that I'm going to link to that I wrote for this episode actually has the video embedded in that. So go check that out and how they kind of spread them out and got their harvest ready. One of the things that's another huge benefit of growing hazelnut, other than the nuts, is the wood. Coppicing hazelwood is huge. It's used in wood production for a whole bunch of things. It actually, and it's good to do that. It's actually good to take a lot of the wood from it. It actually allows the bush to grow stronger and healthier. So you want to coppice some of the wood. It extends the plant's life, and you can get a lot of wood from hazelnut trees. You don't want to start collecting or coppicing big sections of wood for probably about 10 years, the first 10 years of the plant. You can prune it back and obviously get a little bit after about 3 or 4. But if you're going to actually use them for coppicing and like cutting them down, growing them back, you want to wait about 10 years before you start that. Let that root system get really strong. If you're planting it for coppicing, if you're planting hazel on your property for the purpose of coppicing the wood, you'll want to plant them a little closer together. You'll want to tighten them up a little bit, 6 to 8 feet, and thicken them up a little bit, and really get a thick grove of hazelnut. You'll cut your wood back in the wintertime when the tree or bushes are dormant. And after about 10 years, about 75 hazelnut plants will actually produce about a ton of dry wood. So you can get a significant amount of wood from your hazelnut trees after they're established, after they're grown big, and you've got them set up right. How you've been cutting them, how you've been pruning them to get those long, because a lot of times when people are doing it for the coppicing, they'll get these 14 to 16 foot long pieces of wood. It's not huge in diameter, but it's really long because the way they're pruning it back and the way they're cutting it. And you'll just have a whole grove of these really long, straight hazelnut branches. And they're great for all kinds of things. They're traditionally used for things like firewood. I mean, a lot of people use them for firewood, for making poles, fencing, like thatching, walking sticks. They're famous for that. Fishing rods actually is something they're commonly used for. A lot of people use the smaller branches for making baskets. And I mean, just a lot of different little projects. A lot of people. There's a lot of carving projects that work really well with hazelwood. So definitely something to consider when you're growing hazelnut. So not only is it just good food for the food forest, but it's a good product for your homestead for a lot of purposes. So yeah, definitely something that would be benefit to grow a lot of it on your property just for that purpose if you have the room. Of course, hazelnut has a lot of benefits to a permaculture food forest other than just wood and food production. It actually makes a great hedge. It makes a dense screen. So I'm all about growing any kind of a natural type fence or barrier on your property to keep animals, kind of encourage animals from coming in or people from walking into your property. It's nice for that. It can actually create a really thick hedge, which is really, really nice. So, of course, that's going to depend on how close you grow it together, how you prune it, and how you use it. But yeah, it can do that. They're traditionally grown along with things like mulberry, other kinds of vines, gooseberries, currants, things like that. Again, it makes this nice hedge of food. So works well in an agroforestry type setting. It makes a great wind barrier for a property. It doesn't like just be standing kind of by itself out in wind, but in a hedgerow packed with other plants to kind of help it protect it, sections of it will grow really well. And you can actually set up a plant row to act as a windbreaker and kind of alternate the rows for coppicing and picking from and things like that. And it does really well in landscapes. You can shape it in a lot of different ways so it looks really nice. It makes beautiful flowers when it first puts off its flowers. And in the fall, I think it's really beautiful. It has a really nice orange and yellow shade to it that's just really pretty. I mean, so it makes this really beautiful fall hedgerow as well. So, I mean, we're not all about the aesthetics of our food forest, but I find it very encouraging and just uplifting to walk through a food forest that's beautiful. And it really can add to the beauty of a food forest. So depending on how you grow it, where you grow it, and kind of the design and the pruning of it, it can be a really beautiful plant to add to your forest as well, to add onto your property. So yeah, I mean, those are just some other benefits from it. So, I mean, it can definitely serve more than just food and wood. It has, of course, culinary benefits in the nuts. You can eat the nuts raw or cooked. They're rich in protein, iron, magnesium, vitamin B and E. They have heart-healthy fatty acids, omega-6, omega-9, a lot of fiber, antioxidants, a lot of stuff about them. Cancer, fighting qualities. Some of those things are proven to contribute to fighting cancer. So, yeah, I mean, so it obviously has those qualities. You can roast them. and put them in salads, pastas, smoothies. You can actually make a paste out of them and use them. And there's a whole bunch of recipes on the internet on do different things with hazelnuts. So, I mean, you can just look into that. There's a lot of ways to eat them. They also have some livestock benefits as well. The leaves can be used to as cattle feed. Or like rabbits and goats. Also, the rabbits and goats will eat the twigs. They will feed bees with their flowers. They're actually a source of early forage for pollen production for that, so that's nice to have for that. One of the things that hazelnut is kind of known for is their oil. Hazelnut is crushed to produce oil that's used in not so much food, but in other things like paints, cosmetics, hair products. It can be combined with other oils to use things like salad dressings, but it's more used in production of other things, massage oils, skincare products, aromatherapy oils, things like that. So again, if you're into using products on your homestead for making those types of things, hazelnut might be your plant to get because it has a lot of benefits like that. So here's where I'll kind of wrap it up. I mean, we see that it's a plant that just fits really well into an understory tree or a bush layer of a food forest. It has a lot of benefits on your homestead for a lot of production, wood, food, products of other kinds, and protection for your food forest. The bottom line is it's just a great plant. It has some commercial opportunities if you have a really large homestead where you could grow a lot of it for the wood or for the nuts. If you know what you want to achieve and you know how you'd want to grow it, and you select the right type and you got the right growing conditions, it can have excellent yields and it can benefit your homestead in a huge way. So I say grow it. I mean, even if you have to start with 2 or 3 or 4 small hazelnut bushes in an understory area of a food forest, or say along a hedgerow of your property or something, add it. I think you find it being a real benefit to your property. So I think it's a good one to have. I'm looking forward to the production of mine in a few years. I'm actually looking forward to restoring the life of the one I have in the front of my property that's not in ideal growing conditions, because I think I'm going to treat it like an experiment. I want to see if I can create an ideal growing condition around it. I want to put in a tree that's a little bit taller than it on the south side, kind of dapple the sunlight to it. I want to get some nitrogen plants around. I'm going to put a couple comfrey plants close to it. I'm going to mulch it heavily. I'm going to see if I can't change the growing conditions for that plant and get it growing faster as an experiment more than anything. I'm just curious how I can create the microclimate around an existing plant to see it really take off and go. I mean, it's like it's always just kind of barely hanging on for a couple of years now, and I want to see if I can change that. So I'm going to have a little fun with that plant. I think it's a great plant, and you might find it locally. I found mine locally. I think there's a lot of online stores that you can probably get it from. Check your local nurseries, though. They might have it, and that might be your best option for getting a plant that does well in your area. So there you have it, folks. Kind of the everything on hazelnut in your food forest. Give it a shot. I think it could be a great plant for you when you're putting your food forest together. And it just sounds like one of them great permaculture plants that kind of checks a lot of the boxes like a lot of other plants do, serving a lot of functions, working well to integrate into your food forest or permaculture design. So we'll catch you again next week. Thanks for joining me.